Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take dense foundational topics, and today it's the core of population ecology, and we just pull out the absolute key takeaways you need.
Today we're diving into a really fundamental question in biology. What affects the size of a population? I mean, any population, from bacteria all the way to elephants.
hmm
And how does that size change over time?
Our mission here is to really understand the mechanics behind it all, the models, the measurements, and, the evolutionary rules that govern the rise and fall of life.
Right. And to start simply, a population size is really just governed by four things. You have additions from births and immigration.
And removals from deaths and immigration.
Exactly. But the result is almost never simple. Populations can be stable, they can fluctuate like crazy, or sometimes they can make these incredible comebacks.
That recovery story is so well illustrated by the piping plover, that little shorebird on the Atlantic coast. I mean, back in the 80s, things looked really bleak for them.
They did. But ecologists understood the mechanics. They figured out that if they could just protect the nesting sites, they could reduce mortality right at the source.
And their numbers started to rebound. They still vary year to year, of course, but the overall trend is up, all because of that targeted intervention.
And that success, it depends completely on knowing your baseline. You can't manage a population if you have no idea how many individuals you're even working with.
Which brings us to the first big challenge. How do you even define and measure a population?
Okay, so let's unpack that. A population is a group of individuals of a single species in, the same general area.
And density is just how many there are per unit of area or volume, like, oak trees per square kilometer.
But measuring that density, well, that's where it gets really clever, especially for things that move.
Right. If you've got a herd of bison or, like, barnacles on a rock, you can probably just count them.
But for mobile animals, you have to rely on sampling.
And this is where we get the mark-recapture method. It's such an elegant idea used for everything from dolphins to butterflies.
It really is. The process itself is simple. You capture an initial sample. We'll call it sat. You mark them, and then you release them.
And you have to give them time to mix back in.
You do. Then later, you capture a second sample, let's call it none dollar, and you just count how many of them, $6, have the mark you put on them.
And the key insight is that the proportion of marked animals you find in that second group should be about the same as the proportion of marked animals in the entire population.
That's it, exactly. You're setting up a ratio. So for those Hector's dolphins in New Zealand, they first identified 180 of them.
Okay.
Then, in a second sample of 44 dolphins, they found that 7 of them were ones they'd seen before.
So you do the math, and that works out to an estimate of about 11,131 dolphins in total. It lets you count the uncountable.
It's an incredibly powerful tool.
So once we have a number, the next thing is to look at dispersion. How are they all spaced out? And there are 3 main patterns here.
The most common by far is clumped. So individuals are gathered together in patches.
And that's usually about resources, right? Food, water, shelter.
Exactly. Think of mushrooms on a rotting log or sea stars grouping together to breed. They're clumping where conditions are favorable.
The opposite of that would be a uniform dispersion. Everyone is evenly spaced out.
And this is almost always because of some kind of direct interaction. Often it's territoriality. Like king penguins, they defend these tiny little uniform nesting sites really aggressively.
Or I've heard some plants can actually release chemicals to stop others from growing too close.
Yes, that too. And the last pattern, which is actually pretty rare, is random dispersion.
Unpredictable spacing.
Right. This only happens when resources are totally uniform and individuals don't really interact much. No strong attraction, no strong repulsion. Dandelions with their wind-blown seeds are sort of the classic example.
Okay, fascinating. So we know how many and we know where they are. But to predict the future, we need demography.
The study of vital statistics, birth rates, death rates, migration.
How do you even track that?
Well, the traditional tool is a life table. You follow a cohort. That's a group all born at the same time, from birth all the way to death.
Then you're just recording who survives and who reproduces at each age.
Exactly. For Belding's ground squirrels, for instance, the data clearly shows that females have their peak reproductive years between ages 4 and 5.
And you can visualize all that data with a survivorship curve.
Right. It plots the percentage of the cohort that's still alive at each age. And these curves tell you a lot about an organism's life strategy.
So a type-by curve is, well, it's us, right? It's flat for a long time and then drops off sharply.
It is. Low death rates early on, high parental investment. Most offspring survive to old age. Think humans, Elephant.
And you've got the total opposite, type
A
3.
massive drop right at the beginning. Huge numbers of offspring, very little parental care, and most of them die young. Oysters are a perfect example. If they survive that initial phase, they can live for a while,
And in the middle, you have type 2.
which is a constant death rate. Your chance of dying is pretty much the same whether you're young or old. Lots of birds and lizards fit this pattern.
And this is where modern tech is just changing the game. Instead of having to sit and watch a nest, you can now use molecular tools like DNA from loggerhead turtle eggshells.
It's incredible. You collect the shells, you get a genetic profile, and you match it to a database of known females.
All without ever disturbing the turtle.
Right, you get super accurate data on reproduction without stressing the animals. It's a huge win for conservation.
Okay, so now let's shift from measuring populations to modeling how they grow. This is where we get into the really core concepts.
And we start with the ideal but unrealistic scenario: exponential growth.
Unlimited resources, no predators, basically paradise.
Basically, in this situation, the population grows at its maximum possible per capita rate, which we call $2, the intrinsic rate of increase.
And that gives you the famous J-shaped curve.
It does. And what's a little counterintuitive is that even though the rate per individual, $2, is constant, the number of new individuals you add each period just explodes.
Because the base population, N,
Yeah.
is getting bigger and bigger.
Exactly. And we do see this in the real world, but only for a short time. The elephants in Kruger National Park grew exponentially for about 60 years after they were protected from hunting.
But as we know, a J-curve always hits a wall eventually.
And then that wall is reality, which brings us to the logistic growth model.
This is where we introduce the idea of carrying capacity, or $2.
The maximum population size that a specific environment can sustain over the long term. It's defined by limiting resources: food, shelter, water, you name it.
So the existence of dollars has to change the growth equation. As your population, non-dollar, gets closer to dollar.
As the environment starts to push back, birth rates have to drop or death rates have to rise, or both.
And we model this by adding a sort of mathematical break to the exponential equation.
We do. We multiply it by this term, K and K. And you could think of that term as the fraction of the carrying capacity that's still available, the amount of room to grow.
So when N is really small, that fraction is almost 1, and you get growth that looks almost exponential.
Right. And as N gets really close to K, that fraction shrinks towards 0, and growth just grinds to a halt.
Which gives you that much more realistic S-shaped or sigmoid curve.
And here's the critical insight for anyone in conservation or resource management. The growth rate, the number of new individuals being added, is actually fastest when the population is at exactly half of its carrying capacity.
When null L equals over 2.
Exactly. So if your carrying capacity is, say, 1,500, the population is growing fastest when it hits 750. That's the point of maximum sustainable yield.
So you know how much you can harvest without crashing the population's ability to recover.
It's a vital concept. Now, in the real world, it's not always so neat. Some populations, like water fleas in a lab, they often overshoot K.
What?
There's often a time lag. The negative effects of crowding don't kick in immediately, so the population overshoots, and then you see a bit of a crash before it stabilizes.
All of this depends on understanding the specific traits of the species, which gets us into the idea of life history and evolutionary trade-offs.
Right. An organism's life history is just its schedule of reproduction and survival. And because energy is always limited, you have to make trade-offs.
And we see two really big different strategies emerge. First is simulparity.
The Big Bang reproduction.
Mm.
You put all your energy into one massive reproductive event, and then you die.
The coho salmon is the poster child for this.
It is. Or the agave plant. It's a strategy that often evolves in really unpredictable environments, where you might only get one good shot to reproduce.
The alternative is interreparity, or repeated reproduction.
Right, reproducing multiple times over your lifespan. Loggerhead turtles, oak trees, us. This is favored in more stable environments.
And within these strategies, the trade-offs are so clear. You can't have 1,000 babies and take amazing care of each one.
The energy budget just doesn't allow for it. And we see the cost of this so clearly in a study on Eurasian kestrels. Researchers artificially made their broods bigger.
They added extra chicks to the nest.
And they found that the survival rate of the parents themselves dropped significantly the next winter. Rearing those extra young came at a direct cost to their own survival.
So it leads to this big divide. Some organisms produce tons of tiny offspring because survival for any one of them is low.
Like dandelions or quail. And others produce just a few large offspring and invest heavily in them to make sure those few survive, like primates or Brazil nut trees.
And this all feeds into the concepts of R selection and K selection.
It does. Our selection is all about maximizing your growth rate, $3. It favors rapid reproduction in uncrowded, disturbed habitats. Think weeds, the pioneers.
And K selection is for life at high density near the carrying capacity, $2. Here, the selective pressure is on competition and using resources efficiently.
Think of a huge old-growth tree in a mature forest. It's all about long-term survival and outcompeting your neighbors.
Okay, so that brings us full circle. We understand the strategies, so now what actually regulates the population and provides that negative feedback?
Right. And here we have to distinguish between two kinds of factors. First, you have density-independent factors.
These affect the population no matter how big or small it is, like a fire or a drought.
Exactly. The fire doesn't care if there are 10 trees or 10,000, but the regulating factors are the density-dependent ones.
This is where the birth or death rates change as the population gets more crowded.
And there are about 5 main ways this happens. The first is obvious: competition for resources. More individuals mean less for everyone, which can lower birth rates.
Second is territoriality. Animals defending a space for nesting, for hunting, that physically limits how many can live in an area.
Third, and this is a big one, is disease.
Transmission rates go way up in crowded populations. We see this with the flu in dense cities every winter.
Fourth is predation. As a prey species becomes more common, predators might focus on them more, or the prey might just run out of places to hide.
And the last one is really fascinating: intrinsic factors.
This is where the crowding itself causes physiological changes. Studies on white-footed mice show that in crowded conditions, they have hormonal changes that delay maturation and suppress their immune systems, even with plenty of food.
The stress of crowding is a biological regulator.
Exactly. And all these factors can lead to complex fluctuations or population dynamics.
Like the famous 10-year cycle of the snowshoe hare and the lynx.
The classic boom and bust. For years, people thought the hare population crashed because they ate all their food.
But the experiments told a different story.
They did. When researchers gave the hares extra food, the cycle still happened. But when they excluded predators, the hare population didn't crash.
So it wasn't starvation.
It was mainly predator overexploitation. When hare numbers got high, the lynx population boomed and simply ate almost all of them. A powerful interaction.
And we also have to consider movement between populations, which is the metapopulation concept.
Right. A network of local populations living in habitat patches linked by migration.
So some local populations might go extinct, but new ones are being founded in other patches.
Exactly. It's this dynamic flux that keeps the overall metapopulation alive, like the Glanville fritillary butterflies in Finland.
And what's wild is that genetics even plays a role in their movement. Certain gene variants allow some butterflies to fly farther in the cold, making them better colonizers.
It shows how everything is connected, which finally brings us to the human population.
Right, our own species. For most of history, our growth has been faster than exponential. The time it took for us to double our population just kept shrinking, rocketing us to over 7.6 billion today.
But that growth rate is slowing. It peaked in the early 60s at 2.2% a year. Now it's down to about 1.1%.
And that slowdown is because of the demographic transition.
It's the shift you see as a country industrializes. You go from having high birth rates and high death rates to having low birth rates and low death rates. Better health care, sanitation, education, especially for women. It all contributes.
And you can see a country's future growth potential in its age structure.
Absolutely. A country like Zambia has a pyramid with a really wide base. A huge number of young people who are about to enter their reproductive years. That guarantees future growth.
Whereas a country like Italy has a narrow base, fewer young people. So you can project that its population will likely decline.
Which leads to the ultimate question: what is Earth's global carrying capacity for humans?
And the estimates are just all over the place. From under 1 billion to over 1 trillion, it's almost an impossible question.
It is, if you only look at one factor like food. That's why the ecological footprint is a much more useful ideal.
It's not just about what we take out, but what we put back in, right?
Yeah.
The waste we generate.
Exactly. It's the total area of land and water needed to produce all the resources you consume and absorb all the waste you create.
And the sustainable number is about 1.7 global hectares per person.
But the global average today is 2.7. We're in an ecological overshoot. And for the average person in the U.S., it's about 8.
Wow. So it really drives home that it isn't just about how many of us there are, it's about how much each of us consumes.
That is the critical point. Our technology has raised our carrying capacity, but our final impact is a product of both our population size and our massive per capita resource use.
So to wrap up our deep dive here,
The main takeaway is that populations are regulated. They are pushed away from that idealized exponential curve by density-dependent factors. They tend toward a logistic S-curve, defined by a carrying capacity, K. And the life history of a species, whether it's an Y-selected opportunist or a K-selected competitor, determines how it plays that game.
essential stuff. And it's amazing to think that, unlike every other species we talked about, humans can consciously think about and manage our own carrying capacity,
We can.
which leaves a final thought for you to explore. What specific global economic or policy choices must the world prioritize right now, whether it's about resource distribution or technological investment, to ensure that we reach a sustainable global footprint through informed voluntary choices rather than through the negative feedback of increased mortality?
A truly profound question for the coming decades.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.